January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler is sworn in as Chancellor of Germany. He inherits a country that, by almost every economic measurement, is broken. Unemployment had recently approached 30%. The national currency had collapsed into hyperinflationary ruin less than a decade earlier. The reparations imposed by the Treaty of Versailles have stripped the German treasury. Industrial output is in contraction, and the German military, the Reichswehr, is capped by the same treaty at 100,000 men. No tanks, no air force, no general staff, at least not officially. 6 years later, Germany fields the most powerful military force in Europe. By September 1939, the Wehrmacht numbers over 3 million active soldiers. Panzer divisions roll across Polish borders. The Luftwaffe's dive bombers shatter cities with a precision that leaves Allied military observers speechless. Within 2 years, that force will swell toward 8 million men under arms. The Reich will sustain the largest land army in European history across 2,000 miles of front, supply chains of unimaginable complexity, and a war of industrial destruction on a scale never previously attempted. Where did the money come from? This is not a simple question, and the answer, when followed to its logical end, is one of the most disturbing financial histories of the modern era. Because the truth is that Hitler did not pay for his army through honest taxation, responsible borrowing, or sound monetary policy. He paid for it through mechanisms so legally questionable, so structurally reckless, and ultimately so predatory that the only reason they worked was that Germany's government had total control over every institution that might otherwise have exposed the fraud. He created money that wasn't money. He borrowed from the future in ways the future was never intended to honor. He plundered the assets of hundreds of thousands of people, first within Germany, then across occupied Europe, and he did all of it quietly, systematically, and for years, almost invisibly, hidden behind the noise of political spectacle and the machinery of totalitarian censorship. Tonight, we follow the money. From the ruins of Weimar Germany in 1932 to the full industrial mobilization of 1943. From the office of a mild-mannered economist named Hjalmar Schacht to the looting of a continent. From the first shadow currency, printed in secret, to the systematic theft of gold, art, labor, and life from millions of people across occupied Europe. This is not simply the story of how Germany built an army. It is the story of how that army was paid for and what the real cost turned out to be. To understand what Hitler accomplished financially, or more precisely, what he engineered, one must first understand what he inherited. The German economy of 1932 was not merely depressed, it was structurally traumatized. The story of that trauma begins in 1914, when Germany financed the First World War almost entirely through debt and money printing rather than taxation. British and French governments raised significant portions of their war costs through taxes. Germany, whose political leadership feared the social disruption of tax increases, chose instead to borrow. By the war's end in 1918, Germany's national debt had increased by a factor of roughly 20. The Reichsmark was worth a fraction of its pre-war value. Then came the reparations. The Treaty of Versailles in 1919 imposed on Germany a war reparations bill eventually set at 132 billion gold marks, equivalent to roughly $330 billion in modern terms. Germany could not pay. Its export capacity was devastated, its overseas assets confiscated, and its merchant fleet requisitioned. The attempt to meet reparations obligations by printing currency produced the catastrophic hyperinflation of 1921 to 1923, during which the exchange rate between the German mark and the US dollar collapsed from roughly 4 marks to the dollar to 4 trillion marks to the dollar. A single loaf of bread cost billions of marks. People burned currency for heat because the wood to buy was worth more than the notes. Stabilization came in 1924 with the introduction of the Rentenmark and the Dawes Plan, which restructured Germany's debt obligations and allowed a flood of American loans to flow into the German economy. For 5 years, Germany recovered. Industrial output rose. Unemployment fell. The 1920s briefly looked from the outside like a German economic revival. Then came October 1929 and the Wall Street crash. American banks called in their German loans. The credit evaporated. Unemployment, which had fallen to manageable levels, surged back. By 1932, 6 million Germans were officially unemployed, and millions more worked reduced hours or survived on charity. The banking system was in near collapse. The Brüning government responded with austerity, cutting wages, benefits, and spending, which deepened the contraction and accelerated the radicalization of German politics. This was the Germany Hitler inherited, a country with negligible gold reserves, enormous international debts, an atrophied industrial base, and a military limited by treaty to the size of a modest police force. The conventional economic wisdom of the time held that rebuilding German military capacity was not merely difficult, it was economically impossible within any reasonable time frame. Conventional economic wisdom, however, assumed that the actors involved would follow conventional rules. Hitler and the man he chose to run his financial machinery had no such intention. His name was Hjalmar Schacht, and what he built between 1933 and 1937 was arguably the most audacious financial mechanism in the history of modern warfare. Hjalmar Schacht was not a Nazi ideologue, he was a banker. One of the most technically accomplished central bankers of his generation, a man who had performed the near miracle of stabilizing the German currency during the hyperinflation crisis and who understood the mechanics of financial systems with a precision few politicians could match. He despised what he called the economic amateurs around Hitler. But he understood what Hitler wanted. He believed Germany needed rearmament, and he believed he could engineer the financing for it without triggering the inflation spiral that had destroyed the Weimar economy. What he designed was called the Mefo bill system. It was, at its core, a mechanism for creating hidden money. Spending that would not appear in the official government accounts would not trigger the foreign currency restrictions that governed German borrowing from international markets, and would not create the kind of visible monetary expansion that would alarm investors, creditors, or foreign powers who might move to restrict Germany's access to international financial markets. Here is how it worked. The German government created a dummy corporation called Metallurgische Forschungsgesellschaft, the Metallurgical Research Corporation, universally abbreviated as Mefo. This corporation existed on paper only, with a nominal capital of 1 million Reichsmarks. Its purpose was not to conduct any metallurgical research. Its purpose was to serve as the counterparty for a new form of government IOUs, the Mefo bills. When a German armaments company, Krupp, Siemens, Rheinmetall, received a government contract for weapons production, it was paid not in cash, but in Mefo bills, effectively promissory notes drawn on the dummy Mefo Corporation, guaranteed by the Reichsbank, maturing in 3 to 5 years and paying a modest interest rate of 4%. The armaments firm could hold the bill until maturity, or it could present it to the Reichsbank and receive cash immediately. The Reichsbank would then hold the bill as an asset on its balance sheet. The genius, and the danger, of the system was its invisibility. Because Mefo bills were technically private sector instruments issued by a private corporation, they did not appear in the official government budget. The world, including Germany's creditors, the League of Nations monitoring Germany's compliance with various treaty obligations, and international investors, could not see the money being created. Germany's official budget showed a deficit, but one substantially smaller than the true cost of rearmament. The gap was filled by Mefo bills circulating quietly through the banking system. Between 1933 and 1938, approximately 12 billion Reichsmarks in Mefo bills were issued. This figure represents roughly 1/3 of total German rearmament spending in that period. It financed the construction of the Luftwaffe from nothing, including the development of the Messerschmitt Bf 109, the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka, and the entire air infrastructure of airfields, training schools, and maintenance depots. It financed the expansion of the Panzer Arm, the rebuilding of the naval surface fleet, and the infrastructure of military-industrial production. Schacht himself was aware that the system was sustainable only up to a point. Mefo bills had maturity dates. When they came due, they had to be honored, either by rolling them over into new bills, by repaying them in cash, or by engineering inflation to reduce their real value. By 1938, the system was straining visibly. The total volume of outstanding Mefo bills was approaching the limit of what the Reichsbank could responsibly absorb. Schacht warned Hitler that continued spending at the same pace without either increased taxation or reduced military expenditure risked catastrophic inflation. Hitler's response was to remove Schacht from power. In 1937, Schacht resigned as economics minister. In 1939, he was dismissed as president of the Reichsbank. The man who had built the financial engine of rearmament was replaced by officials more willing to accelerate it without asking inconvenient questions about what happened when the bills came due. Because by 1938, Hitler had a different answer to the question of how to pay for his army. Not financial engineering. Conquest. March 12, 1938. German forces crossed the Austrian border in the Anschluss. The annexation of Austria into the Greater German Reich. In London and Paris, governments issue protests and do nothing else. In Vienna, crowds line the streets. And in the Austrian National Bank, German financial officials begin an inventory. What they find is significant. Austria's gold and foreign currency reserves, approximately 200 tons of gold and $91 million in foreign exchange, are confiscated and transferred to the Reichsbank. At the exchange rates of the time, this represents roughly 1 billion Reichsmarks in hard currency reserves. For a Germany that had been running on financial engineering and creative accounting, this is a genuine windfall. But gold is only the beginning. Austrian state enterprises, railways, banks, industrial firms are absorbed into the German economic system on terms that systematically favor German interests. The assets of Austrian Jews, who number approximately 200,000, are expropriated under the same racial laws that had been applied, more gradually, in Germany since 1933. In Vienna, this expropriation is compressed into weeks rather than years. Jewish-owned businesses are transferred to non-Jewish owners at a fraction of their market value through a process the Nazis euphemistically call Aryanization. The difference between the nominal transfer price and the actual market value flows, in various ways, into Reich accounts. The pattern becomes clearer 6 months later. In September and October 1938, Germany dismembers Czechoslovakia through the Munich Agreement and occupies the Sudetenland. In March 1939, German forces occupy the remainder of Bohemia and Moravia, the industrial heartland of Central Europe. What Germany acquires is staggering in its scope. The Czechoslovak military equipment captured or seized is alone sufficient to equip a significant additional portion of the Wehrmacht. Approximately 600 tanks, over 1,000 artillery pieces, and the complete output of the Škoda Works, one of the most advanced armaments factories in Europe, fall under German control. Škoda had produced, by various estimates, a quantity of military equipment roughly equivalent to British armaments production in the same period. Its facilities would continue producing under German management throughout the war, contributing substantially to German military capability. The Czechoslovak National Bank's gold reserves, approximately 45 tons, are extracted through a process so brazen it causes a minor scandal even in London. The gold, held partly in the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, is transferred to the Reichsbank's account through BIS mechanics despite protests. The BIS, an institution created precisely to manage international financial settlement, complies. The episode is a useful reminder that international financial institutions, in the 1930s as in other periods, are not morally neutral entities standing above the political currents of their time. The annexations also solve a problem that Schacht had identified as the fundamental constraint on German rearmament: the shortage of foreign exchange needed to import raw materials. Germany lacked oil, lacked iron ore in sufficient quantities, lacked rubber, lacked many of the industrial inputs required for modern warfare. These had to be purchased from abroad using foreign currency. Currency Germany was chronically short of. Austrian and Czechoslovak foreign exchange reserves, while not enormous, extend German import capacity by months. And the industrial integration of the annexed territories reduces Germany's dependence on some imports by producing domestically what previously had to be purchased internationally. By the summer of 1939, the financial logic of expansion has become, from a narrow German perspective, self-reinforcing. Each acquisition provides resources that extend the financial runway for the next acquisition. The machinery of conquest is not merely a military operation, it is a financial one, and it is about to operate on a scale that dwarfs anything Austria or Czechoslovakia had to offer. The question that hangs over Berlin in August 1939 is this: can the Wehrmacht, built on creative accounting and seized assets, fight a real war against major powers? The generals are about to find out, and so will the German economy. September 1st, 1939. Germany invades Poland. The Blitzkrieg campaign lasts 27 days. The Wehrmacht's military performance is everything the rearmament program had promised. The financial performance of the German economy under war conditions is considerably more complicated. The fundamental challenge of wartime finance is simple to state and enormously difficult to solve. A nation at war needs to redirect a massive share of its economic output from civilian consumption to military production. Soldiers must be equipped, fed, transported, and paid. Factories must be converted, expanded, and supplied. All of this requires money, and in a war economy, money competes with physical resources. Too much money chasing too few consumer goods produces inflation. Too little taxation produces deficits. Too much deficit produces borrowed inflation deferred. The Nazi regime's approach to this problem was a characteristic mixture of ideological rigidity, administrative improvisation, and systematic theft, organized at a continental scale. The first mechanism was direct taxation. Germany did increase taxes during the war, raising income tax rates and introducing a range of special levies. But the regime was acutely conscious of the political danger of economic hardship on the home front. Hitler had studied the German home front collapse of 1918, when war exhaustion and food shortages had contributed to revolution and the abdication of the Kaiser, and had concluded that maintaining German civilian living standards was a political imperative. Tax increases were therefore limited. The German tax burden during the war, as a percentage of national income, was significantly lower than Britain's. The second mechanism was domestic borrowing. The Reich issued war bonds and required German financial institutions, banks, insurance companies, savings institutions, to hold government securities as a prescribed fraction of their assets. This channeled the accumulated savings of the German population into war finance. By 1944, domestic war debt had risen to over 300 billion Reichsmarks, an extraordinary figure that represented, in real terms, a claim on future German economic output that could never plausibly be honored. The third mechanism was the printing press, applied with more sophistication than in the hyperinflation years, but fundamentally still monetary creation. The Reichsbank's note circulation, the total supply of Reichsmarks in the economy, expanded enormously during the war years, from approximately 11 billion Reichsmarks in 1939 to 73 billion by 1945. This expansion was suppressed from manifesting as consumer price inflation through a comprehensive system of price controls, rationing, and the compulsory channeling of spending into war bonds. Inflation was not eliminated. It was hidden. The price increases that should have appeared in the open economy were instead suppressed and deferred, accumulating as a monetary overhang that would eventually surface as catastrophic post-war inflation. The second such episode in a single generation. But none of these mechanisms, taxation, domestic borrowing, monetary creation, could by themselves sustain a war economy of the scale the Reich required without imposing unbearable costs on the German population. The political solution to this constraint was the fourth mechanism, and by far the most important in terms of its scale and its consequences. Occupied Europe paid for the German war machine. In every occupied territory, Germany imposed a system of occupation costs, payments extracted from the occupied government to cover the supposed expense of maintaining the occupying forces. In France, this figure was fixed at 400 million Reichsmarks per day in 1940, a sum so large it represented approximately twice Germany's actual occupation costs, with the surplus flowing directly into Reich war finance. France alone transferred an estimated 20 to 25 billion Reichsmarks to Germany through occupation costs over the course of the war. The Netherlands paid approximately 7 billion Reichsmarks, Belgium 5 billion. The combined extraction from Western Europe represented a subsidy to German war finance that dwarfed any domestic fiscal measure. It was, in plain terms, economic colonization, the use of occupied populations as involuntary financiers of their own subjugation. The financial history of Nazi Germany cannot be told without confronting a truth that is as uncomfortable as it is essential. A significant portion of German rearmament and wartime finance was built on the systematic theft of Jewish property, and ultimately on the theft of Jewish lives. Aryanization, the forcible transfer of Jewish-owned businesses, properties, and assets to non-Jewish German ownership, began almost immediately after Hitler's appointment as Chancellor in 1933. Initially, it was a semi-spontaneous process driven by local SA violence and economic pressure that made Jewish commercial activity increasingly untenable. Jewish-owned businesses faced boycotts, their owners faced physical intimidation, and professional Jews, lawyers, doctors, academics, were progressively excluded from their occupations. After the Nuremberg laws of 1935, the process became systematically legal. Jews were defined as non-citizens and stripped of most civil rights. Their capacity to engage in commercial life was progressively restricted by legislation. The financial mechanism of Aryanization operated as follows. A Jewish business owner facing mounting legal restrictions and social pressure was forced to sell their enterprise. The buyer, typically a non-Jewish German competitor, a Nazi Party affiliate, or a speculative investor, purchased at a price the seller had no practical power to refuse. Reich officials and party intermediaries often extracted fees from both sides of the transaction. The difference between the depressed sale price and the actual market value of the asset flowed through various channels into Reich accounts or into private hands connected to the party. The scale of this expropriation within Germany and Austria is difficult to estimate with precision, but historians have generally placed the total value of Jewish assets transferred through Aryanization within the Reich's pre-war borders at between 1 and 2 billion Reichsmarks, a substantial contribution to state finances in the period of maximum rearmament spending. November 9th to 10th, 1938. Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. Across Germany and Austria, synagogues burn, Jewish businesses are destroyed. and approximately 30,000 Jewish men are arrested and sent to concentration camps. The violence is presented publicly as a spontaneous popular reaction. It is, in fact, an organized operation, and its financial aftermath reveals the true priorities of the regime with brutal clarity. In the immediate aftermath of Kristallnacht, the Nazi government imposed a collective fine on the Jewish community of 1 billion Reichsmarks, to be paid as punishment for the destruction that had been inflicted upon them. The insurance claims of Jewish business owners for the damage done to their property were confiscated by the state rather than paid. The pogrom, in other words, was not merely a terror operation. It was a revenue collection exercise. When Germany began its conquest of Eastern Europe, the scale of this expropriation expanded by orders of magnitude. Poland had a Jewish population of approximately 3 million, the largest in Europe. The Netherlands, Belgium, France, and the other Western occupied territories together held hundreds of thousands more. The occupied Soviet territories contained millions. In every occupied territory, the pattern was repeated. Jewish communities were required to register their assets. Those assets were systematically confiscated. Bank accounts were frozen and transferred to Reich accounts. Businesses were seized. Artworks, centuries of accumulated cultural patrimony, were inventoried and transported to Germany, both for direct financial value and as objects of institutional and private collection by senior Nazi officials. Hermann Göring personally directed an operation to loot the art collections of occupied Europe on an industrial scale. Alfred Rosenberg's Einsatzstab, Reichsleiter Rosenberg, looted approximately 500,000 items of cultural property from Jewish-owned collections alone. The total value of art and cultural objects removed from occupied Europe has been estimated in the billions of dollars. The gold taken from Jewish victims of the extermination camps, dental gold, wedding rings, jewelry, was systematically processed and deposited in Reichsbank accounts under accounts controlled by the SS. The volume of this material was, in individual terms, heartbreakingly small. Accumulated across millions of victims, it became, in the cold language of Reich accountancy, a revenue stream. It is impossible to present these facts without acknowledging what they mean. The Holocaust was not merely a crime against humanity, it was, from the perspective of its perpetrators, also a financial operation. One component of a comprehensive system of plunder that extracted wealth from every individual, community, and institution under German control. The money that paid the soldier's wage, that purchased the fuel for the tank, that manufactured the bullet, was in part the stolen property of the people that bullet was aimed at. By 1942, Germany faced a labor crisis that threatened to unravel the entire war economy. The Wehrmacht had mobilized millions of German men. Those men were no longer working in factories, on farms, or in mines. German women, whom Nazi ideology had designated as belonging primarily in the domestic sphere, were mobilized into the workforce later and less comprehensively than in Britain or the United States. A function of ideological rigidity that cost the German war economy measurable efficiency. The shortfall was filled by force. Fritz Sauckel was appointed General Plenipotentiary for labor deployment in March 1942, with a mandate to recruit, the word is a euphemism, foreign workers for German industry. Over the following 3 years, Sauckel's organization transported approximately 8 million workers from occupied territories into Germany. Of these, approximately 5.5 million came from Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. The conditions under which Eastern European workers, classified as racially inferior in Nazi ideology, were transported and employed bore little resemblance to labor recruitment. They were taken from their homes, transported in overcrowded freight cars, housed in guarded camps, fed at subsistence levels, and worked in conditions that combined physical danger with deliberate dehumanization. By mid-1944, foreign workers, forced laborers and prisoners of war, constituted approximately 25% of the entire German labor force. They worked in steel mills, chemical plants, armaments factories, coal mines, and agricultural operations. German firms, including companies whose products and brand names continue to exist today, employed slave and forced labor as a routine component of their wartime production. Volkswagen used forced laborers to build vehicles for the Wehrmacht. BMW used forced labor in its aircraft engine factories. E.G. Farben, the chemical conglomerate that produced Zyklon B, the gas used in the extermination camps, operated a synthetic rubber plant at Auschwitz III known as Monowitz, using concentration camp labor under conditions deliberately designed to exhaust workers to death within months. These were not exceptional cases. They were systematic features of the German wartime industrial economy. The economic value of this forced labor to the German war effort is difficult to calculate with precision, but estimates by economic historians suggest it was enormous, potentially representing 20 to 30% of German wartime industrial output at its peak. Without forced labor, German armaments production would have been substantially lower, and the Wehrmacht's material capacity for continued offensive operations after 1942 would have been correspondingly reduced. Concentration camp prisoners were also leased directly to German industry by the SS, which charged contracting firms a daily fee per prisoner, typically between 4 and 8 Reichsmarks per day, depending on the prisoner's skill and condition. The SS retained this income. The prisoner received nothing. This arrangement created a perverse financial incentive structure within the camp system. The SS had an economic interest in maintaining prisoner populations alive long enough to extract labor value, while simultaneously operating extermination operations that liquidated those unable to work. The resulting system was not, in any rational sense, economically optimal. It was a moral catastrophe that happened to generate revenue. The accounting of the German wartime economy, viewed in its totality, represents one of the most comprehensive systems of institutionalized robbery in recorded history. Every occupied country paid occupation costs. Every Jewish community had its assets seized. 8 million human beings were transported across borders and compelled to work under conditions that killed many of them. And the proceeds of all of this, channeled through Reichsbank accounts, Wehrmacht supply contracts, and SS financial operations, paid for the army, the aircraft, and the ammunition. The million-man army was not an economic miracle. It was an economic crime, and by 1944, even that crime was failing to sustain it. February 8, 1942. Albert Speer is appointed Reich Minister of Armaments and War Production, replacing Fritz Todt, who had died in a plane crash under circumstances that remain, to this day, somewhat obscure. Speer is 36 years old. He is an architect by training, a man with no formal background in industrial management, and, in the estimation of most of the industrial bureaucracy he is about to take over, almost certainly unqualified for the task. He turns out to be one of the most effective industrial managers of the 20th century, for which history holds him in a deeply ambiguous regard. When Speer takes control, German armaments production is operating at a level that shocks him upon inspection. Despite years of rearmament spending and the enormous financial commitment of the preceding decade, the German war economy in early 1942 is operating nowhere near its theoretical capacity. The reasons are structural. Competing fiefdoms between the Wehrmacht, the SS, the party, and different industrial ministries have created a bureaucratic tangle that prevents rational resource allocation. Factories that should be producing 100% of capacity are operating at 60 or 70%. Raw material allocation is chaotic. Design proliferation, the Wehrmacht's insistence on multiple competing variants of every weapon system, creates enormous production inefficiencies. Speer rationalized this system with remarkable speed and effect. He created central planning committees for each category of weapons production. He standardized designs, reducing the number of competing variants. He transferred production decisions from the military to civilian industrial managers who, in his analysis, understood manufacturing economics better than officers did. He extended the working day in armaments plants, reorganized the supply chain, and used the remaining forced labor pool with ruthless efficiency. The results were extraordinary. Between 1942 and 1944, German armaments production tripled. Tank production, which had stood at approximately 5,000 units in 1941, reached over 19,000 in 1944. Aircraft production more than doubled. Artillery output expanded by factors that baffled Allied intelligence analysts who had expected German production to begin declining as Allied bombing intensified. The Allied strategic bombing campaign, which had been justified partly on the grounds that it would rapidly collapse German industrial production, failed in the years from 1942 to 1944 to achieve that objective. German production continued rising even as British and American bombers dropped hundreds of thousands of tons of ordnance on German cities and industrial installations. The dispersal of production, the use of underground facilities, the efficiency gains from Speer's rationalization, and the enormous labor force of foreign workers, all combined to sustain output that should, by the calculations of Allied planners, have already collapsed. But Speer's achievement cannot be separated from its context. The tripling of armaments production between 1942 and 1944 was achieved on the back of a labor force that was approximately one-quarter slave. It depended on raw materials extracted from an occupied continent. It consumed financial resources that had been accumulated through a decade of fraud, expropriation, and plunder. And it was operating against an economic tide that, by 1944, was becoming impossible to resist. The Allied bombing campaign, which had failed to break German production in 1942 and 1943, began to have decisive effects in late 1944, particularly after the destruction of synthetic oil facilities reduced the Luftwaffe's operational capacity so severely that it could no longer effectively defend German airspace. Allied ground forces advancing from both east and west were progressively capturing the territories that supplied Germany's raw materials. Romanian oil shut off by the Soviet advance in August 1944. Swedish iron ore interrupted by naval operations. Coal from Silesia threatened by the Soviet winter offensive of 1945. By early 1945, Speer himself was privately advising Hitler that the war was economically lost. German production was collapsing not because of any single catastrophic event, but because the entire financial and resource architecture on which it had been built, the plunder of occupied Europe, the forced labor of millions, the creative accounting of the pre-war years, was being dismantled by Allied military force faster than it could be sustained. The army that had been built on borrowed money, seized gold, occupation levies, and slave labor was meeting its final reckoning. And the bill was being presented not to the men who had designed the system, most of whom were still alive, still in power, still planning, but to the populations of every country the Third Reich had touched. May 8, 1945. Germany surrenders unconditionally. The war in Europe is over, and the financial architecture of the Third Reich begins its final, accelerating collapse. The Reichsmark, which had been held artificially stable through price controls and rationing throughout the war, now reflects the reality of 73 billion marks in circulation against an economy reduced to rubble. Hyperinflation returns. The currency is eventually replaced in 1948 by the Deutsche Mark, wiping out the accumulated savings of ordinary Germans for the second time in a generation. The deferred inflation, the monetary overhang created by a decade of deficit spending, Mefo bills, and money printing, finally manifests in the destruction of private wealth that the regime had worked to conceal throughout the war. The domestic war debt of approximately 300 billion Reichsmarks is, in practical terms, annulled by currency reform. The holders of German war bonds, ordinary German savers, who had been financially conscripted into lending money to a criminal enterprise, receive cents on the mark. The losses are not distributed equally. Those with physical assets, property, and productive enterprises survive better than those whose wealth had been held in financial instruments. The occupied territories begin the painful process of calculating what had been taken from them. France estimates its net loss to German occupation at approximately 15% of national wealth. The Netherlands lost approximately 30% of its national capital stock. Poland, which had been subjected not merely to occupation costs, but to deliberate economic destruction combined with the extermination of its Jewish population and the murder of a significant fraction of its Gentile population, suffered losses that defy easy quantification. The human cost cannot be converted into a number that carries moral weight. The Nuremberg trials, which began in November 1945, addressed the financial dimensions of Nazi criminality in the cases brought against major industrialists and financiers. Fritz Sauckel, who had organized the forced labor deportations, was convicted and executed. The directors of IG Farben, who had operated the Monowitz slave labor installation at Auschwitz, were tried in a separate proceeding, the IG Farben trial, and received sentences of prison terms ranging from 1.5 to 8 years, all of which were served in shortened form. By 1951, all had been released. Most returned to senior positions in German industry. Hjalmar Schacht, the architect of the Mefo bill system, the financial engineer who had made rearmament possible, was acquitted at Nuremberg. The tribunal found that while he had provided essential financial services to the Nazi regime's military buildup, he had not been party to the planning of aggressive war or crimes against humanity. He lived until 1970, writing memoirs that presented his contribution to rearmament as a service to Germany, rather than an enablement of catastrophe. History has been less forgiving. Albert Speer presented perhaps the most complex case of accountability. At Nuremberg, he claimed ignorance of the Holocaust and presented himself as a technocrat who had managed armaments production without knowing the criminal context in which it operated. The tribunal was partially persuaded, convicting him of using forced labor, of which he had clear knowledge. While acquitting him of crimes against peace, he was sentenced to 20 years in Spandau prison, which he served in full, emerging in 1966 to write a memoir, Inside the Third Reich, that sold millions of copies and shaped popular understanding of the Nazi regime for decades. Later historical research has substantially undermined his claimed ignorance, finding evidence of his awareness of extermination operations that his memoir carefully omitted. The broader question of corporate accountability, of the firms that had employed forced labor, profited from Aryanization, and produced the weapons of conquest and genocide, was addressed only partially and imperfectly in the immediate post-war period. The Allied occupation authorities dissolved some of the most egregious perpetrators, most notably IG Farben, which was broken into its component companies, BASF, Bayer, and Hixt among them. But the financial and industrial infrastructure of Germany was rebuilt largely by the same firms, and in many cases the same managers who had operated under the Nazi regime. The exigencies of the Cold War, the perceived need for a strong West Germany as a bulwark against Soviet expansion, accelerated the rehabilitation of German industrial capacity at the cost of comprehensive accountability. Restitution for Jewish victims of Aryanization began through negotiations between the West German government and the State of Israel, culminating in the Luxembourg Agreement of 1952, under which Germany agreed to pay 3 billion Deutsche Marks to Israel over 12 years. This agreement, controversial in both countries at the time, represented the first formal acknowledgement by a perpetrator state of financial obligation to victims of state-organized theft. It was significant as a precedent. It was inadequate as a reckoning. The full accounting, to the extent that one is possible, continues. Artworks looted from Jewish collections are still being identified and restituted in courts and cultural institutions around the world. Descendants of families whose businesses were seized at a fraction of their value have pursued claims in German and international courts for decades. The Bank for International Settlements, which had processed the transfer of Czechoslovak gold in 1939 without protest, eventually acknowledged its role and implemented policies designed to prevent recurrence. The process of historical accounting, like the process of financial accounting, does not have a clean closing date. Return, now, to that question we began with. How did Hitler fund a million-man army when Germany was broke? The answer, traced through its full historical arc, is this. He used every mechanism available, honest and dishonest, legal and criminal, innovative and predatory, in a sequence that moved from financial engineering to conquest to plunder to slavery. Each phase funded the next. Each escalation was driven partly by genuine strategic calculation and partly by the internal logic of a system that could not sustain itself without continuous expansion. The Mefo bills bought time, the annexations bought resources, the occupation costs of conquered Europe paid the ongoing bills, the expropriation of Jewish communities across the continent added billions more, and the forced labor of 8 million human beings, many of whom did not survive the experience, provided the industrial output that translated financial resources into the weapons of war. It was not, in any meaningful sense, an economic miracle. Economic miracles involve the creation of genuine wealth, goods and services produced through voluntary exchange, innovation, and productive investment. What the Third Reich created was not wealth. It was a transfer. The largest forced transfer of wealth in European history moved from the many to the few, from the occupied to the occupier, from the persecuted to the persecutor. Every Reichsmark that paid a Wehrmacht soldier's wage carried somewhere in its history the shadow of something stolen. This matters beyond the historical interest of how it was accomplished, because the lesson it teaches is not primarily about finance. It is about the relationship between internal political repression and external aggression. The financial mechanisms that funded German rearmament were possible only in a system where the press was controlled. The courts were subservient, the central bank was directed by political appointees, and the population was denied the ability to evaluate, debate, or reject the policies being implemented in their name. The Mefo bills worked because there was no free press to expose them. Aryanization worked because there was no independent judiciary to protect property rights. Occupation costs worked because the occupied populations had no political representation that Germany was required to acknowledge. Totalitarian financial systems do not create wealth. They redistribute it from the powerless to the powerful, from the margin to the center, and in the case of the Third Reich, from a continent's worth of human beings to a war machine that consumed everything it touched and left, in its final reckoning, a landscape of physical ruin, moral devastation, and a debt to history that can be acknowledged but never fully repaid. The army was built, it conquered much of Europe, and then it collapsed, not because it ran out of soldiers, but because it had consumed every resource within its reach, and still found the task impossible. The continent it had tried to plunder into submission had instead, at the cost of tens of millions of lives, plundered the Reich of everything. The bills, in the end, always come due. If this story moved you, challenged you, or helped you see the Second World War differently, it would be an honor to have you join our growing community. Subscribing isn't just a click. It's a way to support more powerful stories, more forgotten voices, and more truth from the past. So if you believe these stories matter, hit that subscribe button and let's keep building this journey together. And don't forget to leave a comment. We read everyone and love hearing your thoughts. Until next time, keep exploring history with Epic War. Keep asking questions. Keep